Tutankhamun. Born around 1341 BC, Tutankhamun was the son of the pharaoh Akhenaten and a woman believed to be Akhenaten's own sister, making the boy king the product of one of the closest possible blood unions a human being can be born from. His inbreeding coefficient, calculated by a team led by Zahi Hawass and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in February 2010, came in at approximately 127, a figure comparable to a child born of first cousins. And that number was not a statistic sitting quietly in a spreadsheet. It was written into every bone in his body. CT scanning and DNA analysis of his mummified remains revealed a catalog of physical damage that reads less like a medical file and more like a list of punishments. A clubfoot, fused bones in his left foot consistent with Kolar disease 2, a cleft palate, scoliosis curving his spine, and skeletal features that some researchers have associated with Marfan syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that distorts limbs and weakens the heart. He also carried multiple strains of malaria, including Plasmodium falciparum, making his remains one of the oldest confirmed malaria cases ever identified in a mummy. What killed him, most evidence suggests, was not any single catastrophe but a collision of disasters. His body simply lacked the genetic resilience to survive. A severe fracture of the femur, almost certainly from a fall, combined with active malaria infection and an immune system that had been compromised from birth. The pop culture narrative of a cursed pharaoh, of archaeologists dropping dead after Howard Carter opened the tomb in 1922, makes for better television than the actual story, which is far darker. Tutankhamun's death was not a curse placed on him from outside. It was engineered into him by the family that created him, and he spent his approximately 18 years of life, 9 of them as king of the most powerful civilization on Earth, carrying that weight in his joints and his blood. He died around 1323 BC before he could grow a full beard, and his successor A performed the opening of the mouth ceremony at his burial, an honor that would normally fall to a son, suggesting there was nobody left to do it. The tomb was small and unfinished by pharaonic standards, painted in a rush as if nobody had expected him to die quite so soon, even though everything about his body suggested they should have. Cleopatra VII, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 305 BC until Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, did not stumble into inbreeding the way most royal houses did. They made it official policy, modeled it on Egyptian divine tradition, and executed it with the same administrative precision they brought to building grain stores and managing the Nile floods. Brother-sister marriages were the standard, repeated across generation after generation for 275 years. And Cleopatra herself was almost certainly the product of an uncle-niece union, though her mother's identity remains uncertain enough that historians argue about it. She ruled alongside and then against her brother Ptolemy III, to whom she was technically married, and when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, Ptolemy III was already maneuvering to have her killed. Caesar backed Cleopatra, Ptolemy fled and drowned in the Nile, and Cleopatra pivoted to the next most powerful Roman she could find, eventually binding her fate to Mark Antony. The remarkable thing about Cleopatra is that the centuries of inbreeding that had hollowed out later dynasties does not appear to have physically or cognitively damaged her in the way it damaged the Habsburgs, who came after. She spoke 9 languages, governed competently, and outmaneuvered almost everyone around her for decades. This may be because the Ptolemaic gene pool was refreshed, more than it appeared, through concubines and non-dynastic mothers whose identities were not always recorded. But the political system that inbreeding created, the dynasty that could only survive by marrying itself, eventually ran out of options. When Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC and marched toward Alexandria, Cleopatra had nowhere left to go. Antony killed himself first, based on a false report that she was already dead, and Cleopatra followed him on August 12, 30 BC, aged 39. The Asp narrative is ancient, reported by Plutarch and Strabo, and has dominated the story ever since, the small snake hidden in a basket of figs, the theatrical final gesture of a woman who had always understood image and power. But the German historian Christoph Schaefer presented an alternative at a historical conference around 2010, arguing that a fast-acting hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium mixture would have been more practical and more consistent with the descriptions of her death. Neither version has been definitively proven. What is certain is that her death ended 275 years of Ptolemaic rule and handed Egypt to Rome, and the dynasty that had built its longevity on the strategy of marrying itself closed its account with a queen who had no one left to rule beside, Juana la Loca. Juana I of Castile was born in 1479 to Ferdinand and Isabella, two monarchs who were themselves second cousins and required a papal dispensation to marry. And when Juana's marriage to Philip the Handsome introduced the Habsburg line into Spanish royalty, the genetic narrowing that would eventually produce Charles II of Spain began in earnest. Juana is famous for her so-called madness, particularly the story of her grief after Philip died suddenly in September 1506, age 28, reportedly of typhoid fever. According to accounts that have been retold so many times they have taken on mythological weight, she refused to allow his coffin to be sealed, traveled with his body across Castile, and opened the casket repeatedly to touch and kiss the corpse, refusing to let any woman near it out of jealous obsession. Whether this constitutes madness or a grief response so extreme it terrified the people around her is a question historians including Bethany Aram have been asking for decades. Aram and others argue that Juana was not mentally ill at all, or not in any way that would have prevented her from ruling, and that the narrative of her insanity was deliberately constructed and amplified by the men around her. First her husband Philip, then her father Ferdinand, then her son Charles V, because a mad queen was a politically useful queen. She was imprisoned at the castle of Tordesillas in 1509, and she remained there for 46 years. Still technically Queen of Castile, never formally abdicated, never formally deposed, just quietly removed from any ability to exercise power. Modern diagnoses proposed retrospectively include schizophrenia, severe depression, and porphyria, but the honest answer is that we cannot know from this distance what she experienced, only that she was confined in stone rooms for nearly half a century and died there in 1555, age 75, of what contemporaries described as physical and mental deterioration. Charles V abdicated his own vast empire the same year his mother finally died. A coincidence of timing that carries a certain grim weight. Whatever she was, she outlived almost everyone who had imprisoned her, and she spent those decades in Tordesillas, never surrendering the title of queen, which no one could legally take from her even as they took everything else. King Charles II of Spain. If you wanted to design a human being for maximum genetic damage, you might produce something close to Charles II of Spain, and the terrifying part is that nobody designed him. He was simply the endpoint of 2 centuries of Habsburg marriage policy, the final concentrated product of a dynasty that had been folding its family tree in on itself since the 1400s. A 2009 study published in PLOS ONE by Gonzalo Alvarez and colleagues calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, a figure that exceeds what you would expect from a sibling union, because the damage had been accumulating across so many generations that the mathematics of relatedness had grown grotesque. His great-great-grandmother Juana la Loca appears in his family tree more than a dozen times. He was born on November 6, 1661, and the court knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. He could not speak until he was 4 years old. He could not walk until he was 8. He was bald by 35. The famous Habsburg jaw, the protruding lower jaw that appears in Habsburg portraits as a kind of dynasty-wide signature, was so severe in Charles that he could not bring his teeth together to chew food. His tongue was too large for his mouth, and he drooled visibly throughout his life. He suffered from constant diarrhea and vomiting, recurring fevers, and what his court described as fits, which may have been seizures. Despite being king from the age of 3, he was governed by regents and ministers his entire life, his cognitive limitations making independent rule impossible. His court, unable to explain the physical and mental disaster sitting on the throne, concluded he had been bewitched, and the Spanish Inquisition investigated whether his ailments were supernatural in origin, eventually conducting exorcisms. He died on November 1st, 1700, age 38, and the autopsy report, according to contemporary Spanish court records, described a heart the size of a peppercorn, a single atrophied testicle, lungs that had turned black, a putrefied kidney, and a brain filled with water. He left no heir, having been married twice without ever producing a child, and his death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that rearranged the borders of Europe and drew in England, France, Austria, and the Dutch Republic. The most powerful dynasty in the world had spent 200 years perfecting its bloodline and produced a man whose own autopsy read like a horror story, then handed the resulting chaos to the rest of the continent to sort out. Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf II was born in Vienna on July 18, 1552, the son of Emperor Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, who were first cousins, and he inherited both the Habsburg Empire and the accumulating consequences of a dynasty that had been intermarrying for generations before him. He became Holy Roman Emperor in 1576, and almost immediately began retreating physically and politically into the vast castle complex in Prague that would become his true home and his gilded prison. He had almost no interest in governing. What he had intense interest in was alchemy, astrology, art collecting, and the occult, and he assembled one of the greatest collections of curiosities in European history. His Kunstkammer filled with clocks, astronomical instruments, exotic animals, paintings by Dürer and Bruegel, and objects from the furthest reaches of the known world. He brought Tycho Brahe to Prague in 1599 and Johannes Kepler in 1600, two of the most important scientific minds of the age, and he funded their work with genuine enthusiasm while ignoring virtually every administrative responsibility he held. Contemporaries described periods of complete withdrawal from court life lasting months, followed by periods of frenetic, obsessive activity, a pattern that modern historians and psychiatrists have suggested is consistent with severe bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder, though any retrospective diagnosis from 4 centuries away must be held loosely. His mental deterioration became politically catastrophic in his final years. His brother Matthias forced him to cede Hungary in 1608 and Bohemia in 1611, and the imperial title followed. Rudolf died in Prague on January 20th, 1612, age 59, officially of gout and general physical decline, though the more complete picture is of a man whose inbreeding-linked psychological fragility had made him genuinely incapable of holding together an empire, and who spent his final years stripped of almost everything he had nominally ruled. The 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history, began in 1618, just 6 years after his death, partly because the power vacuum he created during his disintegrating reign had never been properly filled. King Philip II of Spain. Philip II of Spain was born on May 21st, 1527, the son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal, who were first cousins, and he would go on to rule the largest empire the world had yet seen, the Spanish Americas, the Philippines, named in his honor, Portugal after 1580, Naples, Sicily, and vast stretches of Europe, all from a desk in the granite monastery palace of El Escorial outside Madrid, where he reportedly read and signed documents for so many hours a day that his eyesight deteriorated visibly. He was a man of extraordinary administrative capacity and extraordinary genetic inheritance, and the two things coexisted in him until the end, when the genetic side won decisively. His 4 marriages were all within the Habsburg network, and his 4th wife, Anne of Austria, was his own niece, continuing the narrowing that would eventually produce Charles II. Philip died at El Escorial on September 13th, 1598, age 71, and his final 4 months of life were among the most agonizing recorded deaths of any European monarch. His gout had progressed to such severity that tophus deposits, crystallized uric acid, had fused his fingers and locked his joints. His body was covered in suppurating sores and gangrenous wounds so severe, according to multiple contemporary accounts, that he could not be moved without screaming, and his clothing could not be changed for weeks at a time because removing it would tear the infected tissue beneath. He was carried to a room at El Escorial specifically positioned so that he could see the altar of the basilica from his bed, dying with the view of the sacrament he had spent his entire reign defending with fire and fleet. The man who had launched the Armada against England, who had overseen the conquest of the Philippines, who had signed documents governing millions of lives across 4 continents, spent his last months unable to lift his own fused and rotting hand. The empire he left behind was already beginning to fray at the edges, and the genetic legacy he passed to his descendants would finish the job his enemies had started, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart was born on December 8, 1542, at Linlithgow Palace in Scotland, the daughter of James V and Mary of Guise, and she became Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old, her father dying of fever shortly after the catastrophic Scottish defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss. She was raised at the French court, married the French Dauphin Francis, who became Francis II, and died within a year of his accession, then returned to Scotland, a young widow to a kingdom riven by religious conflict and suspicious of its Catholic queen. Her second marriage, to Henry Stuart Lord Darnley, her first cousin once removed and a fellow descendant of Henry VII of England, produced a son who would become James VI of Scotland and James I of England, uniting the crowns. But the marriage itself was a disaster of jealousy, political incompetence, and violence. Darnley was murdered in February 1567 in an explosion at Kirklefield in Edinburgh, and Mary's rapid subsequent marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of arranging the murder, destroyed her political position entirely. She was forced to abdicate, fled to England, and spent the next 18 years imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth I, becoming the symbolic focal point for every Catholic plot against the Protestant English throne. The Babington Plot of 1586, which aimed to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne, gave Elizabeth's council the evidence they needed, and Mary was tried and condemned. She was executed on February 8, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, age 44. She dressed in a dark gown with a crimson underdress, the color of Catholic martyrdom, and according to contemporary eyewitness accounts, the execution was genuinely horrifying. The first blow of the axe missed her neck and struck the back of her skull. The second severed the neck, but left a strip of skin connecting the head to the body, and a third stroke was required. When the executioner lifted her head by the hair to display it to the witnesses, the head fell, revealing that she had been wearing a wig and that her real hair was cropped short and gray. Her death, intended to end the Catholic threat to Elizabeth's throne, had the immediate opposite effect. Philip II of Spain used it as one of his justifications for launching the Armada against England in 1588. Don Carlos of Spain. Don Carlos, born July 8, 1545, was the son of Philip II and his first wife Maria Manuela of Portugal. And if you want to understand just how extreme a single-generation inbreeding event can be, consider that Philip and Maria Manuela were double first cousins, meaning they shared all 4 grandparents between them. The mathematical consequence was a child who was more inbred than the product of a typical sibling union, concentrated into a single generation rather than accumulated across many. From birth, his body showed the results: one shoulder higher than the other, a marked spinal curvature, one leg shorter than the other, and a fragile overall constitution sitting inside a body that grew unusually tall. His behavior as he grew older became frightening by any account. He reportedly threw a page boy from a window. He attacked the powerful Duke of Alba. He reportedly confessed to a priest that he intended to kill his own father, Philip II. These accounts come primarily from diplomatic dispatches and may be colored by political motivations, but the pattern they describe is consistent. A young man whose impulse control, emotional regulation, and capacity for rational decision-making had been severely compromised by his genetic inheritance. Philip II had him arrested in January 1568, issuing a statement about matters of importance to God and the public good, without elaborating further, and Don Carlos was confined in a room in the royal palace, where he proceeded to destroy himself by alternating between complete starvation and frantic overeating, drinking enormous quantities of ice water in the summer heat, and sleeping on bags of ice. He died on July 24, 1568, aged 23, his body having simply collapsed under the contradictions he imposed on it. Friedrich Schiller turned him into a tragic romantic hero in his 1787 play, and Verdi adapted that play into one of his great operas. But the historical Don Carlos was something more complicated and more sad. A boy whose DNA had decided his fate before he was old enough to understand what fate meant. King Charles, the Ninth of France. Charles IX was born on June 27, 1550, the third son of Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici, and he became king at age 10 following the death of his brother Francis II, which meant that his mother Catherine served as regent, and in practice continued to dominate him long after he had technically come of age. The Valois dynasty had been intermarrying within European royal networks for generations, and Charles exhibited the kind of psychological instability that contemporaries noted, and historians have since analyzed: extreme volatility, swinging between deep withdrawal and explosive rage, and a weakness of will that made him susceptible to the influence of stronger personalities around him. The event that defines his reign is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 23 and 24, 1572, in which the royal council, with Charles's authorization, ordered the assassination of Huguenot leaders gathered in Paris for a royal wedding, and the violence spread through the city and then across France into a slaughter that historians estimate killed between 5,000 and 30,000 people, the range itself indicating how complete the chaos was. Charles reportedly watched from a window as Huguenots were killed in the streets below, and by some accounts participated actively in the early stages. What followed, according to his physician Ambroise Paré and other contemporaries, was a psychological collapse that expressed itself physically. Charles began sweating blood, a rare but real condition called hematidrosis, in which extreme psychological stress causes blood to seep through the sweat glands and appearing at the skin's surface. Whether this account is literal, symbolic, or exaggerated by those writing it down is impossible to confirm at this distance, but the accounts are consistent across multiple sources. He died on May 30th, 1574, age 23, of tuberculosis, which had been consuming him for months, his body hemorrhaging blood in his final days in a way that contemporaries found profoundly meaningful. His death without a legitimate heir passed the crown to his brother Henry III, and the Valois dynasty, rotted from within by decades of dynastic marriage politics, had only 15 more years before it too would end. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV of Russia, born August 25, 1530, became Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3 and crowned the first Tsar of all Russia in 1547, and his reign stands as one of the longest and most violent in Russian history. 37 years of expansion, terror, and psychological collapse that left the country he had built teetering on the edge of dissolution. The Rurikid dynasty had practiced dynastic endogamy across generations, and Ivan's own marriage choices compounded the pattern. He married at least 6 women, possibly 8, several related to him within the dynastic network, acquiring each new wife after the previous one died under circumstances that contemporaries found suspicious. Soviet-era forensic analysis of his remains, conducted in 1963, found elevated levels of mercury, arsenic, and lead in his bones, which may indicate poisoning by enemies, or simply the long-term accumulation of contemporary medicines, in which heavy metals were common ingredients. His mental deterioration across the decades of his reign is well documented in the accounts of foreign ambassadors, Orthodox clergy, and his own correspondence. The creation of the Oprichnina, a personal secret police state, within the state that terrorized the Russian nobility for years. The 1570 massacre of Novgorod, in which he ordered the systematic killing of thousands of his own subjects over weeks. And then, on November 19, 1581, the moment that defined everything, when during a violent argument he struck his son and heir Ivan Ivanovich with his iron-tipped staff, causing a head wound from which the young man died 4 days later. Ivan the Terrible spent the following days in a state of complete psychological disintegration, tearing his hair, refusing food, and weeping without stopping. He had killed the only son capable of succeeding him, and he knew it. He died on March 28, 1584, reportedly while setting up a chess game, collapsing suddenly of what was most likely a stroke or massive cardiac event, 3 years after the moment that had ended his dynasty more completely than any enemy could have managed. King James I of England. James II of Scotland, who became James I of England in 1603 and united the two crowns, was born on June 19, 1566. The son of Mary Queen of Scots, and her first cousin once removed Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, both of them descended from Henry VII of England. He was, therefore, the genetic product of a dynastic intermarriage at the very moment the Stuart line was under the most extreme political pressure, and he inherited a kingdom from a mother he had never really known, who had been imprisoned since he was less than a year old. His reign produced genuinely lasting things: the Gunpowder Plot of November 5th, 1605, which failed, the King James Bible of 1611, which did not fail, and became one of the most influential texts in the English language, and the Jamestown Settlement of 1607, the first permanent English colony in North America. Contemporary descriptions of James himself, however, are striking for their consistency. His tongue was described as too large for his mouth, causing him to speak with difficulty and to drool visibly. His legs were described as weak and his gait as shambling. He disliked changing his clothing and wore garments until they were worn to rags. And his court was defined by his intense relationships with male favorites, particularly Robert Carr and George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, which generated political controversy and gossip throughout his reign. He suffered from arthritis, gout, kidney disease, and recurring bouts of what contemporaries called tertian ague, a fever pattern consistent with malaria. He died on March 27, 1625, age 58, at Theobald's Park in Hertfordshire, of a final acute episode of tertian ague. Some contemporaries allege that Buckingham had poisoned him, a charge that was raised publicly and investigated but never substantiated. The king, who had commissioned the Bible that would carry his name for centuries, died in a country house, shaking with fever, far from the throne that had defined him, leaving behind a son, Charles I, whose own relationship with inbreeding and power would end on an execution scaffold. Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand I, born April 19, 1793, became Emperor of Austria in 1835, and his reign stands as one of the most unusual in European history, because the man on the throne was, by virtually every account, genuinely incapable of governing, and everyone around him knew it and did it anyway. His parents, Emperor Francis II and Maria Theresa of the Two Sicilies, were first cousins, and Ferdinand was the culmination of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, carrying in his body the consequences of a dynasty that had been circling its own gene pool since before Columbus reached America. He suffered from epilepsy severe enough that contemporary court accounts describe him experiencing multiple seizures on a single day, as well as hydrocephalus, a condition in which fluid accumulates within the skull, a pronounced speech impediment, and a cognitive profile that made independent decision-making essentially impossible. His ministers, particularly Prince Metternich, governed in his name so completely that Ferdinand was almost purely ceremonial, a figure who sat on the throne while others moved the pieces. He is beloved by historians for a quality that has nothing to do with governance, his apparent sweetness and lack of pretension. The story, possibly apocryphal but too good to abandon, is that when told he could not have apricot dumplings because apricots were out of season, he declared that he was the emperor and he wanted dumplings. A response so utterly human in the middle of all the dynastic horror that it has survived 2 centuries of retelling. When the revolutionary upheavals of 1848 shook every throne in Europe, Ferdinand abdicated on December 2nd of that year, passing the crown to his nephew Franz Joseph III, and retired to Prague, where he lived quietly and apparently contentedly for another 27 years. He died on June 29, 1875, aged 82, of a stroke, making him one of the longest-lived of the severely inbred Habsburgs, which suggests something worth noting. Remove the crushing pressure of royal expectation from a man whose genetics have already loaded the dice against him. Give him consistent care and a calm routine, and the body can endure far longer than anyone expects. King Afonso VI of Portugal. Afonso VI of Portugal, born August 21, 1643, became king at age 13, following the death of his father João IV. And his reign is one of the most complete demonstrations in European history of how inbreeding-linked impairment, combined with the specific pressures of monarchy, can create a cascading catastrophe that destroys everything it touches. At approximately age 3, Afonso suffered a severe illness, possibly meningitis or encephalitis, that left him with permanent paralysis of his left arm and leg, and what contemporary court accounts describe as significant cognitive and behavioral impairment. Though historians have debated how much of what was recorded reflects his actual condition, and how much reflects the hostile perspective of the courtiers who wrote it down. What is documented is that as a teenager and young king, his behavior alarmed everyone around him. He reportedly preferred the company of street criminals and people from the edges of Lisbon society over his own court, organized gang fights within the palace, and proved essentially ungovernable by conventional means. His marriage to Marie-Françoise of Savoy was never consummated, which she attributed to his physical incapacity and impotence, and after years of this, she sought and obtained an annulment and married Afonso's brother Pedro, who had already been named regent and who had been systematically dismantling Afonso's remaining power. Afonso was confined first on the island of Terceira in the Azores beginning in 1669, isolated in the middle of the Atlantic, and then transferred to the Palace of Sintra in 1674, where he remained until his death. He died on September 12, 1683, age 40, of apoplexy, what we would now identify as a stroke, after years of physical and mental deterioration and confinement. He had been king of a country that needed him to be something his genetics had made impossible for him to be, and the machinery of royal succession had simply moved around him, transferring power to his brother while leaving him technically on the books as a king, alone in stone rooms at the edge of the Atlantic for the final decade and a half of his life. King George III of Great Britain. George III was born on June 4, 1738, became King of Great Britain and Ireland in 1760, and reigned for 60 years, the longest reign of any British monarch to that point, presiding over the loss of the American colonies, the wars against Napoleon, and his own spectacular, prolonged, and deeply public mental collapse. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who was his first cousin once removed, continuing the pattern of dynastic endogamy that had characterized the Hanoverian line, and they had 15 children, the most of any British royal couple. George's episodes of illness began in 1788, when he became acutely disturbed. He talked continuously until his lips bled. He reportedly repeated the word peacock for hours at a stretch. He attempted to strangle his son, the Prince of Wales, and he wrote letters and sentences that ran for pages without punctuation. Then he recovered, returned to apparent normalcy, and the cycle repeated across the following decades. In 1966, psychiatrists Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter published a paper in the British Medical Journal arguing that his symptoms, including blue-tinged urine, severe abdominal cramping, weakness in the limbs, and the neurological and psychiatric episodes, matched acute intermittent porphyria, a genetic metabolic disorder in which the body cannot properly produce heme and toxic compounds accumulate in the nervous system. The porphyria hypothesis has been influential but contested, with some researchers now favoring bipolar disorder, and others pointing to the complexity of distinguishing one condition from another across centuries of filtered accounts. Analysis of hair samples discovered in 2004 revealed elevated arsenic levels, suggesting that the arsenic present in many of his medical treatments and in pigments of the era may have triggered or worsened porphyria attacks if he did carry the condition. By 1810, George III had descended into a state from which he never emerged. Blind, deaf, and in a condition his physicians described as permanent insanity, he wandered the rooms of Windsor Castle in a purple dressing gown, playing the harpsichord and talking to people who were not there. He died on January 29, 1820, aged 81, of pneumonia, a decade after he had last recognized any member of his family. His son had been ruling as Prince Regent since 1811. The 60-year reign that had watched the birth of the United States ended in a room at Windsor where the king had not been present, in any meaningful sense, for 10 years. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Elizabeth of Bavaria, born December 24, 1837, known to history and to everyone as Sisi, was the daughter of Duke Maximilian of Bavaria and Princess Ludovica, who were first cousins, and she was born into the Wittelsbach family, a dynasty with its own rich and extensively documented history of mental illness running through multiple generations. When she married her first cousin Emperor Franz Joseph the Surfer of Austria in 1854, at age 16 she joined her inbred Wittelsbach genetic inheritance to the centuries of accumulated Habsburg inbreeding, and the results in her children were significant. Her son Crown Prince Rudolf was psychologically unstable from early adulthood, reckless, depressed, and increasingly erratic in his behavior, until the morning of January 30th, 1889. When he shot his 17-year-old mistress Mary Vitsera at the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Mayerling, and then shot himself, leaving a note for his mother and leaving Austria without a direct heir. Elizabeth herself was not spared. She suffered from what modern clinicians would almost certainly identify as anorexia nervosa, obsessively monitoring and restricting her food intake, exercising compulsively for hours each day, and maintaining a waist that surviving dresses at the Hofburg Museum in Vienna confirm measured approximately 50 centimeters, just under 20 inches, on a woman who was 172 centimeters tall. She loathed the ceremonial obligations of being Empress, spent years traveling restlessly across Europe and the Mediterranean under the pseudonym Countess Hohenems, and wrote poetry that expressed a death wish with increasing directness as she aged. On September 10, 1898, she was walking along the shoreline of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, approaching the gangplank of a steamship, when the Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini stepped forward and appeared to punch her in the chest. She stumbled, rose, said she was fine, walked up the gangplank, and collapsed. Lucchini had stabbed her through the chest with a sharpened needle file, approximately 4 inches long, and the weapon was so narrow that it had passed between her ribs and pierced her heart without leaving a visible external wound large enough for her to recognize immediately. She died approximately an hour later. The Habsburgs would outlast her by 2 decades, but only barely. The empire collapsed in 1918, and the centuries of inbreeding that had begun when one family decided its blood was too precious to share with the world outside had run finally all the way out. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.